So this is part 2 of the roundtable, Conceptualizing Vulnerability, being hosted by the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad in India. The two of us here, that is Professor Anna Kurian and myself, there's one more person who will join now, constitute the chair as a unit. I'm the chairholder. This came through in November 2022. It was inked in 2022. And it's classified as a teaching and research unit by the UNESCO. So the idea of discussing, thinking about, and researching vulnerability also involves, as per the mandate given to us, some amount of teaching, offering courses, developing open educational resources, hosting symposia and workshops, and research and publications. We have identified a few core areas in the application which was sent up to UNESCO, which includes aging, gender, climate change, and precarity as broad brushstrokes of what we want to do. It's a 4-year tenure, and we have launched and finished one elective course in vulnerability in the MA program of the Department of English. The other one is just ongoing, and it's on colonialism and vulnerability, looking at British India. We have talks done already, more to come. We have had publications. We expect to have a lot more happening over the next year or so. The idea of this particular roundtable was to think in terms of different disciplinary contributions to how we can conceptualize vulnerability. So last week we had 2 people speaking on media and information precarity. We have people in literature. If Harriet joins, that would be law contributing to this. Lisa's specialization, of course, is gender and women's studies, but has also worked across disability and medicine. So that brings one more angle. The person who was supposed to speak today has dropped out because of illness, and he works for a risk analysis unit and has been trained at the World Bank. So we had a quantitative assessment expert who looks at calculations of risk. Last week's panel had Scott Slovic, environmental literature and humanities specialist, speaking on planetary precarity and projects underway. So that's the broad mandate of the chair. And we hope over the next 4 years to bring people together to talk about it from their disciplinary perspectives, but also to advance our understanding of this currently trendy topic of precarity. I mean, every second book seems to have at least one essay on it. And it's a kind of catch-all category which has emerged, which pretty much happens with all of Judith Butler's work. It becomes a kind of lingua franca for theory itself. So with this, I'm very grateful to you, Lisa, for making time from your schedule and being very enthusiastic, shall we say, to come to us on this particular topic. I'll now hand you over to, and the evening over to Atul Nair, who's our project assistant. Meenakshi, whom you have glimpsed already, is our other project assistant. Meenakshi was working for our other project, Indian Writing in English Online, the world's first open educational resource for the genre. This, as of last week, joined a job elsewhere. Atul is working on a PhD on the construction of Indian literature in English periodicals, 1790 to 1840 or so, roughly the period covered by things like the Asiatic researches and things like that. So over to you, Atul, for the introductions, and welcome.
Thank you, Professor Nair, and welcome, Professor Diedrich. Not that you need any introduction to this meeting today, but then still, if I may introduce Professor Lisa Diedrich, who is a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Stony Brook University. Her research and teaching interests include critical medical studies, disability studies, feminist science studies, and interdisciplinary feminist and queer theories and methodologies. She is the author of Indirect Action, Schizophrenia, Epilepsy, AIDS, and the Cause of Health Activism, published in 2016, and Treatments, Language, Politics, and the Culture of Illness, 2007. She is also the editor with Victoria Hesford of the collection Feminist Time Against Nation Time, Gender, Politics, and the Nation State in an Age of Permanent War, published by Lexington in 2008, and a special issue of Feminist Theory titled Experience, Echo, Event, Theorizing Feminist Histories, Historicizing Feminist Theory. She's currently working on two projects, an edited collection with Brianna Martino called Keywords Images in Graphic Medicine, and a monograph titled #Illness Politics. With this, may I welcome Professor Lisa Diedrich to today's roundtable titled Conceptualizing Vulnerabilities. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm going to be talking about the Illness Politics project in this presentation. So yeah, this should be good. Meenaksha, you want to put my slides up? If you can. Good. Yeah, good. Perfect. Okay, we'll start with that one. And, let me just say thank you to everyone, Pramod and Anna and the project assistants. I mean, you guys are fantastic. This is a really great project, and I am quite thrilled to be able to participate in it. And also, I mean, it's kind of it is, I think, Pramod, you're right, that precarity is a kind, and vulnerability are kind of catch-all terms. And but I think it's really important to kind of try to analyze what's going on with that sort of terminology. So I'm really excited to sort of participate and be a part of this. So thank you for this invitation. My presentation is a part of a book I'm working on, which is called #Illness Politics, which I hope will be published soon-ish as part of the University of Minnesota Press's Forerunner series, which I just mentioned this because it's a series that's of kind of slightly shorter books that publishes kind of thought in process scholarship. So where there's kind of analysis, questioning, and speculation is sort of the mandate of this series. And it's meant to be sort of timely topics. And so you'll see, I think, some of why I hope this is a kind of timely topic. I'm going to introduce the larger project just very briefly, and then I'm going to present some material from one of the chapters. So next slide. Illness Politics explores illness and disability in action on social media, analyzing several popular hashtags as examples of how illness figures conceptually and strategically in recent US politics. And my focus is on the US, but I hope that maybe we can think through how this might be interesting in relation to the Indian context. I demonstrate how illness politics is informed by, intersects with, and sometimes stands in for sexual, racial, and class politics. This project is connected to a growing body of work that explores forms of health activism and disability and illness politics as central, not peripheral, to both mainstream and radical politics, as well as work on the dynamic intersection of media and health activist practices. Illness and disability-oriented hashtags serve as portals into how and why illness and disability are sites of political struggle. In the larger project, I first take up two hashtags, Sick Hillary and Trump is not well. And I can talk about these all of these hashtags at length if you want to talk about them. Used in the US presidential election campaigns of 2016 and 2020, to demonstrate how illness politics has operated in recent mainstream electoral politics, where illness functions as a metaphor for a candidate's supposed unfitness for office. I then explore illness and disability activist hashtags, including Adapt and Resist, Crip the Vote, and Time for Unrest, as examples of counter portals into other forms of illness, thought, activism in time. In these various hashtags of illness and disability in action in the present moment, the violence and exclusions of recent policies are revealed. Yet these examples also reveal a multiplicity of practices of vulnerability and heroism, confrontation and compromise, exhaustion and endurance in an ongoing struggle for care, access, and full citizenship and personhood. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I focus on the multiple temporalities of chronic fatigue syndrome through an analysis of CFS experiences and events as documented in Jennifer Brea's film Unrest from 2017, and through the hashtags Time for Unrest and Millions Missing. Brea's film shows illness and illness politics as operating biopsychosocially across different spaces and temporalities, including on social media, which becomes a site of a kind of embodied assembly where people gather while remaining at home and in their beds. Next slide, please. In her book, and here she is, Judith Butler, in her book on precarity in public assembly, Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, Judith Butler explores the question of whether the destitute are outside of politics and power or are, in fact, living out a political agency and resistance that expose the policing of boundaries of the sphere of appearance itself, end quote. I will also explore this question of how those deemed outside, my lights are going to go off. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. Now, I will also explore this question of how those deemed outside the limits of the political, in this case, the sick and bedbound, nonetheless, as Butler posits, break into the sphere of appearance as from the outside, as it's outside, confounding the distinction between inside and outside. Brea's film and related hashtags on social media create the conditions of possibility of this breakthrough into the sphere of appearance, despite, or perhaps because, such action exhausts, literally in the case of CFS, any one individual's capacity to appear. Brea's film presents what I call the historical persistence of hysteria, a diagnostic category replaced by conversion disorder, but nonetheless haunting the phenomenological experience of illnesses like CFS without yet known biological causes. At the same time, the film also attempts to capture the experience of embodiment as a kind of endurance, and as extreme fatigue and sensitivity to light, sound, and surroundings make CFS a condition of unrest, a disturbed and uneasy state that is at once physical, social, and political. Next slide, please. Early in the film, as Brea films herself with her phone, struggling to crawl across the floor to her bed, she anticipates a question that might be on the viewer's mind. Why would I film it? Her answers, because I think someone should see this, and I didn't know what else to do, so I kept filming, suggest both a politics of visibility and a politics of endurance, or the politics of making endurance visible through practices of documenting illness and illness politics that connects to other historical and contemporary examples of illness and disability in action, including, importantly, to the emergent illness of long COVID in the present. Next slide. Brea, her film, and the hashtags Time for Unrest and Millions Missing, among others, challenge in important ways what activism and the figure of the activist look like. By connecting with people with CFS online, Brea not only documents their experiences with CFS, but also seeks to politicize the lack of participation of people with CFS who she describes as missing in action from society and the public sphere. With the film and hashtags, Brea demonstrates illness in action as a kind of unrest cure. I conclude this, I'm going to conclude this discussion by bringing it really up to date by discussing the recent protest in September 2022, organized by the ME Action Network, that took place in front of the White House and on social media to draw attention to the continued underfunding of research on ME CFS, even despite increased interest in understanding the long-term impact of viral infections with the emergence and widespread experiences of long COVID. My goal in highlighting this recent demonstration of illness politics is itself meant as a form of illness politics. That is, as participating in by amplifying a struggle for an egalitarian social and political order in which a livable interdependency becomes possible, as Judith Butler delineates in her lecture on Bodies in Alliance and the Politics of the Street. Brea presents her own experience of illness as personally, phenomenologically, and politically confounding. Clips from home movies show an active little girl, and more recent film footage and still photographs give a glimpse of an adventurous young woman, always on the move and determined, as she puts it, to swallow the world whole. This visibly active life ends when Brea is 28. While working on her doctorate at Harvard, so warning, she gets sick with a very high fever and ends up bedridden. She is exhausted in a way she has never felt before. The side of her face becomes numb. Sometimes she is unable to speak or think coherently, and she becomes sensitive to light and sounds. She sees every kind of specialist, but no one can say exactly what is wrong. Eventually, a neurologist diagnoses conversion disorder, speculating that the likely cause is either a distant trauma that she doesn't fully remember or recent stress from, wait for it, preparing for doctoral exams. Conversion disorder is a new term for an old illness, hysteria. The term itself emerged in 1980 as part of the bioscientizing, evidence-based impulse of the third edition of the U.S. Psychology's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-3, and is defined as a psychoneurosis in which bodily symptoms such as paralysis of the limbs appear without physical basis. Next slide, please. With its ever-changing terminology and multitude of somatoforms, hysteria operates historically like the diagnosis itself. The category appears to suffer from conversion disorder, or put another way, we might say, diagnostically, hysteria is hysterical. A short history of hysteria is at the center of Brea's film, which presents the experience and event of hysteria as a slideshow. Next slide, please. A series of black and white historical images of hysterics flash by, accompanied by a syncopated beat, the combination of image and sonic reverberation heightening the feeling of the persistence of hysteria as a repetition compulsion of a diagnostic category that is characterized by a certain photogenicity. Unrest historical hysterics are all women, and Brea's treatment of them suggests the importance of the still and moving photographic image in enacting hysteria across different times and spaces. Hysteria, of course, has long association with the female body and women. The symptoms and significations that concatenate around the sign of hysteria are multiple and mobile. Hysteria's habit of mimicking other diseases makes hysteria not one disease, but many, if not all diseases, at least potentially. As I argue in all of my work, illness and illness politics are performative, understood in the way Butler utilizes the term in relation to her theories of gender and now precarity, because she's saying precarity is performative as well. These theories have been utilized to discern, importantly, the how, not the what, of gender, along with race, class, and sexuality, and also illness together. So where illness is concerned, the utterance, you have blank, and you can choose your any disease here, doesn't simply name an existing biological condition, it brings that condition into being. When certain conditions and procedures are met, the authority of a doctor making the diagnosis, conclusive lab work, and test results, then a person can be said to be ill. When these conditions are not met, then the person often becomes mentally rather than physically ill. Next slide, please. Hysteria as conversion disorder becomes a kind of illness performative as the default category that has persisted over time for illnesses not yet explained biologically. This repeated not yet helps explain, I think, hysteria's persistent yet divergent and multiple enactments. Unrest's syncopated slideshow of hysteria visually captures hysteria as illness performative. Although Brea refuses the diagnosis of conversion disorder, I just want to be clear that there, she's challenging this diagnosis of her own situation. So she refuses that diagnosis for herself. She nonetheless links her experience to the history of hysteria and its visual somatoforms. Her desire to document her own and others' experiences of CFS is motivated by an understanding that the past isn't so strange and distant. People, women mostly, are still being locked up in institutions or trapped in bedrooms they never leave because their illnesses are not treated as real. Brea believes we should know and do better now, but she comes to realize from her own experience of illness and from documenting illness, hers and others, past and present, that we're still doing this, still doing hysteria. This is what Ed Yong, reporting on COVID long haulers, calls the long history of medical gaslighting, in which a patient's physical suffering is downplayed as being all in their head or caused by stress or anxiety. In my conclusion, I'm going to return briefly to the experience and event of long COVID and to work by activists and some scientists as well to make connections between the symptomatology of long COVID and ME/CFS as a form of illness politics that seeks to counteract medical gaslighting. Next slide, please. Bedridden for several years and living in limbo without a conclusive diagnosis, Brea describes how her once wide world shrinks to one room. She begins to search online for possible clues to what has caused and what might treat her intractable condition. Her own research leads her to what she will discover is the still somewhat controversial diagnosis, CFS, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME, and to a whole community of sufferers in the shadows of society. As Brea writes in her director's statement, she fell down this rabbit hole and discovered a hidden world of thousands of patients all around the globe, many of whom are homebound or confined to their beds and use the internet to connect with each other and the outside world. Along with documenting her own experience of CFS, Brea is determined to document the lives of others, some 17 million worldwide, the millions missing, as proclaimed by another hashtag generated by the film to highlight the problem of lack of visibility and research on the problem of CFS. The lack of visibility and research on ME/CFS is a result of the fact that doctors and scientists can't find a biological cause and so doubt the realness of the illness except as a present-day form of hysteria, hence the conversion disorder diagnosis. In her book, The Rejected Body, Susan Wendell discusses how chronic illnesses and illnesses with unknown etiologies are a problem for medicine. Medicine tends to dismiss or deny the existence of what it cannot explain physiologically or treat successfully. Next slide, please. Medicine has significant cognitive and social authority in contemporary society, affecting, Wendell argues, how we experience our bodies and ourselves, how our society describes our experiences and validates or invalidates them, how our society supports or fails to support our bodily sufferings and struggles, and what our culture knows about the human body. End quote from Wendell. Wendell's interest in the philosophical importance of chronic illness and disability emerges out of her own experience with ME, which, as with Brea, came on suddenly and devastatingly in February 1985. Unlike Brea, Wendell is very lucky in relation to her doctors, who recognized at once that something was seriously wrong and found evidence in blood tests that indicated a viral infection. She saw specialists in infectious disease and immunology and was first diagnosed with acute infectious mononucleosis, then chronic Epstein-Barr virus syndrome, before doctors finally arrived at the then newly emergent diagnosis, ME. Wendell notes that the history of my own illness has coincided with the gradual discovery of ME/CFS by the rest of the world. She describes learning to live with chronic pain, muscle weakness, profound fatigue, much more total and exhausting than any fatigue she experienced when healthy, dizziness, depression, headaches, problems recalling words, etc. Wendell provides an especially astute critique of what she calls the able-bodied paradigm of humanity, which relies on an idealized view of the body as young, healthy, and always up to speed. 20 years after the publication of Wendell's incisive critique, Brea's film documents the still significant difficulties people with ME/CFS have in finding validation for their phenomenological experiences of their bodies. Wendell offers insight here as well. She tells a story about how she came to realize she had to be cautious in how she described her symptoms when a specialist showed surprise when she used the vivid metaphor of being injected with strong poison to capture how she felt at the moments her illness relapsed. Very early in Unrest, as Brea and her husband Omar wait to see a doctor, they discuss a similar discursive tightrope. If you say too little, they can't help you, Omar says. If you say too much, they think you're a mental patient. Next slide, please. Wendell argues that what medicine lacks is an effective vocabulary for the phenomenology of illness. She explains that patient support groups are valuable in that they offer a context in which people who are ill can work together to articulate their experiences of their bodies, to find or invent a phenomenological vocabulary that is adequate. End quote. This is what Brea's film in particular and illness politics in general also do. Find and invent a vocabulary, a phenomenological vocabulary for illness, updating and extending Wendell's support group by connecting to others online. And as we see in the present moment, the phenomenological vocabulary and online illness politics of ME/CFS has provided a portal into the confounding experiences of long COVID, which shares many symptoms with ME/CFS, including debilitating fatigue. Brea's description of her phenomenological experience of CFS is remarkably like Wendell's. Next slide, please. Both discuss a cellular exhaustion, as Wendell puts it, or becoming less and less effective at the cellular level, as Brea says. Wendell anticipates the dismissive reactions to such a theory of cellular experience. Certainly, I do not experience my body as cellular, but I experience the exhaustion as so deep and pervasive that it feels as though something is wrong throughout my body on the cellular level. Brea moves between scales from questions about the metabolic crash point and how that feels. When we crash, we disappear, she says, to questions that after 30 years still need to be asked. Why do more women get it? Is it genetic? Why 30 years later are we no closer to a cure? For Brea, it is time for unrest, and her film and advocacy work operate across multiple temporalities and spaces to bring illness inaction into the public. The narrative arc of Brea's film is from rest to unrest, from passivity to activity, and from private to public. Brea explains that what terrifies her is that you can disappear because someone is telling the wrong story about you. Thus, unrest seeks to tell a truer story, but also to make visible the millions missing from public life. The film doesn't end with triumph, but with images of protest and a statement of endurance and repetition. I am still here. I am still here. So I'm going to conclude by showing how the struggle that Brea documents in her film continues in the present moment, or as in the recent slogan created by ME/CFS activists, still sick, still fighting. Again, this is one of the key functions of hashtags, to expand and extend the parameters of an action beyond a particular space and time into the present and the future. Next slide. In September 2022, the ME Action Network, which describes itself on its website as igniting a global revolution in ME care, organized a Millions Missing protest in front of the White House in Washington, D.C., and online. The goal of this protest was to tell President Biden that the pandemic is not over and that millions are being disabled with post-viral disease, including long COVID and ME/CFS. The protest was a demonstration of both illness and illness politics that I would argue, following Butler, brought the material urgencies of the body into the square and made those needs central to the demands of politics. In her series of lectures on the performativity of assembly, Butler is interested in moments when precarious lives assemble on the street in forms of alliance that must struggle to achieve the space of appearance. In the case of the Millions Missing protest, one form of alliance that was demonstrated was between people sick with ME/CFS and people sick with long COVID in a mobilization of vulnerability. As Ben Suborger, a person with ME/CFS and the ME Action Network advocacy director, explained about the protesters, we are sick and disabled with ME/CFS and long COVID, but are here today, putting our bodies on the line to send a clear message that we need urgent action from our government. Next slide, please. ME Action Network documented the protest with a live stream on Twitter that was watched by over 9,000 viewers that day, and clips of which have since been uploaded to YouTube. Coverage on the ME Action website emphasized the material urgencies of these bodies in public, and an ME Action press release documented the impact of the protest on the protesters' bodies. The protesters, this is a quote, a long quote, the protesters, most of them sick with ME/CFS and or long COVID, struggled to go on as their symptoms worsened with the exertion of chanting, walking, and being in the heat. They will now spend days crashed in bed with worsened symptoms, attempting to recover from the hours they spent making their voices heard, end quote. Other press coverage also highlighted the protest as a demonstration of illness in action. Zaina Terfekci, opinion columnist and author of Twitter and Tear Gas, wrote about the protest for the New York Times in late October 2022 in a piece titled, "Protesters So Ill They Couldn't Get Arrested." Terfekci's piece begins with a story about one of the protesters, Gabriel San Emeterio, who is HIV positive and has ME/CFS, and who tells Terfekci that HIV has been less onerous than ME/CFS, which Terfekci calls this more obscure affliction. Terfekci then describes the protesters as giving their best shot at civil disobedience, but adds that instead of being arrested, they were largely ignored. This narrative of a failed protest relies on the image of the heroic activists on the streets, defying the police and the law to risk arrest and generate media attention for their cause. The aftermath for this Millions Missing protest in front of the White House was not disruption, arrest, and imprisonment. Rather, as Trefekci reports, the aftermath was the appearance of a symptom of the protesters' conditions, post-exertional malaise, PEM, which is experienced by people with both ME/CFS and long COVID. So I'm almost at the end. I'm losing my voice. Trefekci discusses how PEM may be one reason ME/CFS and even long COVID has been dismissed so often as a serious condition by many doctors. Trefekci discusses how a symptom like post-exertional malaise is stigmatized as a sign of an unwillingness to push through illness. She notes that this glorification of pushing through is part of an ableist culture of medicine, in which medical training normalizes pushing through exhaustion as part of the process of becoming a doctor. Thus, an antagonism can arise between doctors and those patients deemed not sick, but malingering. However, Trefekci's coverage of the protest and its aftermath is key. The protest becomes a spectacle of illness politics when the media covers it as such. Trefekci asks a question that has been central to my analysis of illness politics on social media. How do you protest when the very act is a dire threat to what little ability you have left? Yet, she makes the mistake of assuming that the only playbook to follow is the one AIDS activists used years ago, escalating civil disobedience. She then describes a cat and mouse game with police on the day of the protest, in which the police managed to direct traffic around protesters lying in the street, and in the end, the protesters' failure to escalate as they became exhausted from their efforts to appear in public. Yet I contend that, in the case of the Millions Missing protest, the spectacle is not civil disobedience and arrest, but a less visible but no less powerful form of embodied resistance. The willingness to make oneself sicker, to draw attention to one's illness and the politics surrounding it. In her analysis of hunger strikes in prisons, Butler argues that bodily exposure can take different forms. Her point that sometimes deliberately exposing the body to possible harm is part of the very meaning of political resistance is relevant in the case of the Millions Missing protest. Last slide. One more slide. Yeah. The activists who participated in the protests at the White House and online demonstrated what it means to mobilize vulnerability in concert. In concert is not simply on the street, but beyond it through the hashtag on social media that continues the mobilizing of vulnerability in concert, even as the activists return home and to their beds to recover from the exertion of their illness politics. Thank you. That's it. Last slide says thank you, I think. There we go. Thank you.
Oh, there it is. Hello, Anna?
Yep.
You're
Here.
this background noise. No, it's okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That's exhilarating, to put it mildly. I was just wondering when you were speaking about this kind of disease conditions, syndromes, does it have something to do with questions of temporality as well? In the sense, why do we call it by the name long COVID?
Yeah.
And most of these, because there is something to do with condition of chronic illness as opposed to something else. So a cardiac problem resolved by surgery as opposed to something like CFS. So even if it is a conversion disorder where there is no underlying pathological cause, it does have something to do with a kind of extended duration, the long durée of illness, if you can think of it in those terms, deep time kind of thing. And also where I was just, this is just perhaps talking off the top of my head, what about conditions of inherited illnesses? Those are intergenerational. That again is about time, because lineage after all is about time. And movement in time. So a disease that moves across time. I'm thinking of things like Huntington's, which are multi-generational in many cases. So entire families have the condition. So though of course those are not conversion disorders in the sense there is now a genetic anomaly that they detect and there are tests and things like that. But I was just thinking that in the wake of the pandemic, as you've been talking about, Emmy and others, there is a sense of continuity and continuum of an interminable condition that haunts all these accounts. In India now, when we see the public discourse, a lot of things are attributed to the long COVID.
Right.
There is no clear diagnosis that it is an aftermath of COVID or it's a variant of something that has gone wrong. But everything is now attributable to COVID itself, which again seems to me, without an underlying pathology which is diagnosable, you can always attribute everything to COVID. And so the question of temporality and the question of disease go together. That's one. And the other is this, that are we not making COVID itself I don't know, it seems awkward now to re-invoke this metaphor of this as a metaphor for things. You know, COVID becomes a kind of shorthand. So that is a very easy way of describing a vulnerable condition. It's a COVID-related thing. So we get people talking about it in our public discourse, as I said, and you go to doctors, they'll tell you, there's possibly a COVID aftershock.
No, that's great. I mean, yes, absolutely. I agree with sort of everything you said, because certainly just chronicity, right, is versus a kind of acute condition. Chronic conditions are not particularly well handled by medicine. I mean, I think it's still the case, even though we have a politicization. What I'm trying to kind of look at is also that we have this politicization of these experiences through illness and disability activists. But nonetheless, medicine still doesn't particularly handle chronic conditions well. So there is something, what is the time of medicine? What is the temporality of medicine? I think this is a huge question, and it's one that I'm really interested in. So yeah, you're getting at it. What kind of confounds medicine? And there's lots of things that confound medicine. I'd say the frustration for me, and we see this with long COVID and we see it with ME/CFS, is you'd kind of think that might create a situation where there would be people would be interested in kind of studying that. And that's not particularly been the case. We do see some folks now. I think this is the connection between long COVID and ME/CFS is going to be really interesting going both ways, because of course the long COVID, the fact that long COVID is becoming a metaphor for everything means we might spend more time looking at that, investigating that, putting more money into investigating research and trying to understand how it works. But we're not so much seeing that yet. So that's kind of, I think it's interesting that we're still seeing a kind of resistance to the diagnosis, long COVID, even within medicine. And so what is that about? That's kind of, for me, that's about medicine's epistemic authority, as Wendell puts 20 years ago, writing about this. And she's saying that medicine doesn't, maybe can't be authoritative about certain conditions. And so in a sense, those get dismissed or underplayed or turned into, mental hysteria, basically. So I think that's the key for me. What is the temporality of illness? And so then what are medicine's temporalities, and how does medicine deal with illness. And then the other, COVID as a shorthand, that's going to be really interesting to watch how that might happen. And COVID as a kind of metaphor that might, the problem of that, of course, is that it might mean that we're not looking at the specificity of people's experience. We're just sort of using this as a kind of overarching metaphor, and it could become a way of just kind of dismissing. And so that will be sort of interesting to attend to as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I had two things further to say in what you were saying. One, when I think of metaphor, I also think of the way we are inventing categories for geological time, like the Anthropocene. So this could well be a COVIDian age in that sense, because that's the way it's circulating in public discourse. So you have a COVIDian era, which brings under its broad umbrella practically anything and everything, primarily because the diagnostic tools are insufficient, there isn't enough research. So it serves a purpose. The other part to this is when you were speaking about the chronicity, that medicine doesn't acknowledge it. But the one area in which the chronicity is acknowledged is medical insurance. Pre-existing conditions, as they call it. And there the temporality is their all important, all determining frame, isn't it? So medicine doesn't have a terminology, but medical insurance does. And when you think about that kind of temporality, where their primary concern is, has anybody in your family ever? Have you been diagnosed this at some point in your life? When was the last time you took a vaccination for this? And they seem to measure all of these medical consequences, conditions in temporal frames. How long have you had it?
That's right.
Since, so, and there this comes into the epistemic order there seems to be entirely time-based.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's not funny because it was on Twitter. I saw an article in Stat News, which is about AI being used by insurance companies to determine the length of time that somebody would get care for certain conditions. And so what this article was about and why it was kind of horrifying was that AI is determining, well, in fact, we're only going to pay for care for a week. And that's determined by artificial intelligence and not determined by any kind of real examination of the person and the person's actual needs. I mean, thinking about vulnerability and precarity and kind of trying to sort of measure that somehow, right? No, we're going to determine this and we're going to shut down, stop the money coming to you or the support for this kind of in-home care, say. And of course, this is a kind of horror story that's an American horror story because of the horror story of American health insurance or lack thereof. But still, it's one of these things where you realize, oh, yes, what is the time of illness? What is the time of insurance and care? And also, this idea that we can sort of determine when time's up. And then even though people, of course, can fight it. So this article sort of discusses how people fight those denial of care. But of course, that struggle, time is on the side of the insurance company, not on the side of the poor sick person, whose nurse no longer is going to have nursing, in-home nursing, say. So all of that is kind of frightening to think about how that sort of determination is generated. And I think, what you're getting at is, medicine is also these kind of, insurance is part of medicine or is part of our experience of medicine. And thinking about that is kind of
it's a horror story, like you said. But it also has deeper roots, because I know that earlier to mid 19th century, the Lloyd's Bank and other insurance companies in England prepared a map of the world where several sectors, colonies obviously, were marked in red. And they said, these are not places we would encourage you to go, or if you're going, our insurance will not cover it. So the early banking and insurance sector in England was already thinking in terms of hotspots, places. And there, actually, if you think about the temporal, those are, shall we say, endemic conditions in those countries. They're pre-existing conditions of the nation itself, so we cannot ensure that. So it's not the person there as much as a geopolitical space where you would not want to guarantee somebody's healthcare.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, right. And the sort of the idea of insurance determining, yes, of course. So the idea of pre-existing conditions, or I talk about in my book, Indirect Action, this phrase underlying conditions, because the AIDS activist Larry Kramer uses this term, underlying conditions. And yes, I mean, I think so nations within the kind of transnational world system, nations have pre-existing conditions, or power determines what those pre-existing conditions are. And I think you're right. This is a kind of there's a long history of this. There's also, just the insurance companies' involvement in the slave trade and determining, whether, they would, throw slaves overboard because it was more cost efficient, those kind of things, that sort of history, I think it is horrific. And we still see it kind of embedded. I mean, the afterlives of slavery in the current moment. And this has to do with pre-existing conditions.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I'll hand you over to other team members here. Meenakshi, Zaid, Anna, Atul.
Thank you, Professor Diedrich. So I have a bunch of observations, and I'm hoping a question emerges at the end of this.
That's great.
So I was listening to you, and I was also thinking of all of these other books that have spoken similarly of conditions such as CFS. One is, of course, Through the Shadowlands, and it's very interesting how the subtitle of the book is A Science Writer's Odyssey into Illness That Science Does Not Understand, or something to that effect. And this is something that you brought up towards the end of your presentation. This conflict between medicine and the layperson's narrative of it. I was also then thinking of Sick by Parujista Kapur, which even more clearly shows the politicized patient, because she's a woman of color, she's from Iran, and both of them are also presenting this sort of skewed temporality. And I say skewed because it does not fall into line with a narrative temporality of illness that has been presented even in scholarship before. So how you start off with the scene of diagnosis, and then there's treatment, etc. But CFS or any chronic disease really inverts that sort of thing, because diagnosis comes towards the very end, and you've got all of the other institutional politics that comes right before it and plays a huge part in it as well. All of these texts really, including Unrest. Unrest has the figure of the husband in it, and he's this really skeptical witness. And each of these works, including Parachista Khakpur's Sikh, show you this sort of illness narrative that does not fall in line with other narratives that have a sort of a structured temporality to them. So that's one thing. Another thing is, I was wondering if you think chronic illnesses themselves could be or rather the representation of chronic illnesses could be a feminist issue. And I'm saying this because of the corpus of work that has emerged from women on chronic issues when compared to texts that have been autobiographies or biographies written by men.
Mhm.
I'm also thinking of uh, chronic illnesses and the genre itself. So I read a blog post by Rachel Lindsay, the one who wrote RX, the graphic memoir, a few days back, and
Yeah.
she wrote about how her identity as somebody who's ill uh, often takes over her identity as a creator. Now that she's written her memoir about bipolar, uh, the stigmatized identity of being ill takes over,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and she is much more than that. But then she also says she'd like to keep at it. She is sick,
Yeah.
she's owned it, and she'd like to continue being sick. And that's something that all of these women actually show in their work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so you have got the whole performative versus, you've got that thin line between performing your illness and romanticizing it, but you've got it in very different ways. So
Yeah.
do you think hashtag politics, and this covers all of the different movements that you were talking about, including something like a hashtag me too, do you think hashtag politics also tries to very subtly tread that line between romanticization and actually owning your identity?
Yeah. Wow. That was great. Those comments were really helpful, and I appreciate your kind of connecting to other illness narratives, right? And sort of looking at how, and especially illness narratives by women, women of color, and how, what they're doing in those illness narratives. So, I mean, the first thing I would say that you kind of made me think of that is sort of we see a lot is, because I like your point that diagnosis sometimes comes towards the end. Certainly that's the case in Kakpour's book, Sick. And or they, the thing about Jen Brea, and I don't really update it. I kind of keep the film as a film in the context of the film, but I'm not even, I think that her diagnosis is complicated, and I'm not even sure whether now she says she has CFS. So that's a complication there. But this idea of diagnosis coming at the end, the arrival to it and the relief of it. So the idea that, I mean, I certainly don't want it by saying that diagnosis is performative. I don't want to take away how that can be really important, right, for people, because one of the things that often happens is if you don't know, and not knowing this kind of uncertainty about what's going on, that diagnosis can be some certainty about what's going on, and that can be really helpful for a person, and it can also sort of make other people take seriously their illness, right? So I that's really important. And a lot of people talk about that in illness narratives, the kind of almost the relief of getting a diagnosis. So I think that's also a kind of temporal thing, how that's working. And I think you point that out really well. But there's also, I mean, for sure, gender plays a part, and this is, and and lots of, in illness narratives, lots of people talk about their experience of medicine in a very gendered way, not being taken seriously. But I'd also say that, especially in the U.S. context, it's not just gender; it's also, of course, race and class play a role in medical gaslighting, as Ed Yong calls it. And he's quoting someone, but this idea that, medicine does not take seriously people's own subjective accounts of their experience of illness. And so that becomes kind of hugely problematic. And I think, and that's where often politics emerges, because you're trying to get care, you're trying to be taken seriously, you want others to believe you, right? And so I do think it connects with things like Me Too, where your authority, where you're speaking your experience is difficult, first of all, and then also that it's likely to be denied or not taken seriously. So I think there is a kind of link there. And I think the hashtag politics is important on that level because it does link people. And I mean, one of the things, though, that I'm really trying to do with hashtag illness politics is to question, and I think this was in the paper some, but not forefronted as much as it could be, but to sort of really challenge this idea of what the activist looks like, right? And so people have, lots of people are very dismissive about hashtag politics. They say things like, well, you're just on Twitter, you're not in the street, right? You're not really doing anything. And so I want to show that this is really crucial. And the example I use in the book is Crypt the Vote, hashtag Crypt the Vote. If you don't know that hashtag, you might want to check it out because it's really interesting in terms of creating an online community of disabled people, linking disabled people all over the world, and kind of politicizing the experience of disability, and making it a kind of making a space for participation in the public. And this is crucial for people who are sick and disabled. And I think that the fact that this kind of thing gets kind of dismissed out of hand by certain people is one of the problems. So I really want to kind of think about that, how we can challenge our idea when we think of an activist, what that looks like. I want to kind of challenge that. But finally, the last thing that I'll say in response to, the idea that this becomes your identity. And yeah, I mean, the Rachel Lindsay stuff is so amazing. And I think I also, maybe you know this, but I'm really interested in graphic narratives and how graphic narratives kind of thinking about graphic medicine and how we can kind of show the experience of illness. And one of the things about graphic narratives is actually that they can kind of, this idea of co-temporality, where you can see we can like visualize the past on the page with the present simultaneously on the same page, I think creates a kind of formal way of showing an experience. And it graphic narratives sort of formalize the experience of illness, I think, really well. And Rachel Lindsay's work is really exciting in that respect. But there is always the problem of being sort of delimited as, this is who you are. And that struggle, I think, is important. And to me, that's a kind of struggle against the stigma of, that illness is somehow, or disability is somehow, you're reduced to that, right? That's not a part of a component of who you are. And so how do we kind of maintain these other ways of being in the world when we're ill? And I think art is one way that we do that. Art and politics are two ways that we do that, where we're kind of participating in the world, not just necessarily through illness. But I do think that's really important. And I think a lot of illness narratives, people who are writing about their experience of illness, sort of describe this conflict of both wanting to articulate their experience and making people understand their experience of illness and feeling that it's difficult, but also not wanting to be, reduced to this experience. Yeah, I don't know if that answers everything, but those are some thoughts.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anna?
Professor Diedrich, yep. Professor Diedrich, these are, I think, just observations because I don't really know anything about the area you work in. So, but nonetheless, one was about when you were speaking about the fact that people still revert to hysteria as the default option for women. we had this phase in India, and this was just prior to COVID. So if we speak of COVIDian time, then pre-COVID.
Yeah.
In India, when people went to the doctors with niggling symptoms of several small kinds, so whether it was stomach issues or whether it was headaches and migraines, everything was brought down to one common denominator: stress.
Mhm.
And they would then tell you that instead of, I mean, they would do some symptomatic relief treatment, but then they would say that it's because you're stressed, so you need to do lifestyle changes and so on and so forth. And even if there is no change in your health condition, it was still seen as this is your diagnosis, that you have stress. You're stressed about situations. So they'll ask you intrusive questions sometimes about home situations and such, or work situations and such. And then they'll let you go. And there is no coming back from that. And you go on suffering. So when you were speaking about the fact that sometimes just getting a diagnosis is, and a diagnosis which works, right? So the medical, and again, conditions in India being very different in terms of how medicine works over here, the numbers of patients there are for doctors and things like that. I mean, we are huge in terms of numbers. And there was a period in, I think for about nearly 10 years, wouldn't you say, Pramod, where everything was about stress. It did not matter what you presented with.
Yeah.
It still
That,
is.
Yeah.
no, now we have COVID as well. So,
But they do tell you that if you get stressed, your immunity levels go down and you are more susceptible to COVID. So
Yeah.
COVID now has a stress cause as in
angle
physiology.
to it. But my thing was that what you said, that which is why it rang those bells, that one, we are still stuck in certain ways of looking at people where we would rather dismiss it as something inside your head or the ways in which you're reacting to things, rather than saying that maybe there is a reason and investigating that reason. And for us in India, because investigations are always expensive for people, they can't afford it. So it's far easier to say that it is. And so it's also a question, I guess, of ease, expense, all of those. Like the person in the movie who spoke about, who was, and as opposed to the rejected person who, Wendell, who actually got a diagnosis.
Yes.
To be able to get a diagnosis, or to be able to get a doctor to listen to you and then kind of connect the dots, so to speak, and make sense of it, it's near impossible. And especially if you go as a woman, as somebody maybe who doesn't have that level of economic purchase or class status as well, then you're not even getting a hearing, as in your symptoms are listened to for maybe a couple of minutes, and then this easy diagnosis is trotted out. So that was what I was thinking about when you were speaking.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I completely agree with you. Stress has become a kind of catch-all that, I mean, the interesting thing is there are two things about stress, I think. First of all, that yes, I mean, we could look at when that kind of emerged and began to be enacted as a kind of diagnostic category. And in the US context, I mean, there's a Cellier's book called Stress, which came out, I think, early 60s. But we began to sort of talk about stress as a factor in illness. The one issue is that becomes, in many instances, sort of individualizing, right? So that's about you and your body rather than about the structures or wider systems that you're in. So I think there's really interesting work in the US context, of course, about African Americans and their experience of medicine, their very negative experience of medicine. And so the failure to diagnose certain conditions, especially in relation to women. So like the fact that African American women are much more likely to, who are pregnant, are less likely to be diagnosed with certain conditions and are much more likely to die in pregnancy in the U.S. context than white women. And of course, it's kind of famously the Serena Williams story, where she was experiencing certain things that should have been very quickly spotted and kind of taken seriously, and they weren't. Even Serena Williams, right, the tennis star, and who has a lot of capital, but still nonetheless was kind of dismissed. Her pain and her experience was dismissed. So I think there's two things going on there. One is that we might want to kind of understand, and some people have been talking about this, the sort of experience, the embodied experience of racism, say. So people in the US context are using the term weathering to kind of suggest something about how the stress of racism impacts the body. And so, I mean, what we kind of don't want to do is sort of biologize it to say that, oh, this is genetic, so there's a propensity for Black women to have certain experiences, but rather to kind of think about how racism impacts the body. So I think you're right. You're capturing all the way this is an important category, but in fact, it's a category that's used to individualize and dismiss rather than to kind of think through some of the larger structures, social structures that might be impacting people's embodied experiences. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah. Unless Atul. Atul?
Do we have time for one last question, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, one. Yeah. From you, yes.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I work in a very different area, so I'm sorry if my question comes across as rather banal or even naive, but I was interested in the idea of the diagnosis itself as an affective category, as in how does a diagnosis affect both the sufferer as well as the caregiver, the doctor, as in, because through your talk you emphasize the importance of diagnosis and demonstration, as in the idea of disease being something that has to be performed, that has to be demonstrated, and only then will it be acknowledged by either the state or for that matter the healthcare mechanism. And people with something like chronic fatigue syndrome who cannot really do that and who will not be recognized as being ill. I mean, the thing that you'll be recognized as being ill only so long as you can perform it. So I was thinking of the idea of the diagnosis itself as something that can affect the way people think about the disease, the way in which they receive, they understand the disease itself. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important, to kind of thinking about illness as an affective experience. And so all the different activities that happen impact our experience of illness. So diagnosis, treatment, getting better, all of those have affective components. And I think that's a really important observation. And I'm glad you said it, because I wasn't really thinking about it so much that way. But that's related to what I was trying to say about how a diagnosis can be a relief. It can actually make people feel validated in their experience. So that can be perhaps, something that is emotionally helpful to them. Just being taken seriously can actually have a kind of affective component that can be helpful, healing almost. I think that's key. And, the other kind of way to think about it is in terms of just if something's not, and this is what happens with sort of chronicity, where people might be sympathetic, but it's that, at least initially so, but then there's a kind of feeling, this relates again to kind of temporality, there's a feeling that you should be getting better. And so the experience of the kind of affective experience of which people who have chronic illness sort of deal with, so let's say chronic pain. So you have chronic experiences of pain. It comes and it goes, and you have to manage your life accordingly. And so that's a kind of affective experience in terms of, okay, I could be having a really great time and then suddenly I feel bad again. I didn't realize it was going to happen. But also people around me are not able to, kind of switch, or they're sort of they become frustrated with, the unpredictability of the experience. And that seems that unpredictability has a real affective component. It can kind of create feelings of frustration, even anger, and disbelief on the part of the person and also the people around them who are having to sort of understand this condition that's very difficult to kind of communicate about. So yes, I think that's all. I was thinking about this idea of, the importance of, healing as a kind of healing as not just about getting better, but as a kind of producing a sort of environment that, feels right for oneself, right? So that what's going on there is about the body, of course, but it's also about the sort of the transmission of affect in the world around the sick person. So yeah, I think that's a really great point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor Diedrich, this is not an observation about your talk, but this is about what we have planned for, I think, April. We are doing a series on drawing vulnerability, and we would be very happy if you would also like to listen in. We'll be putting up the recordings online afterwards, but we've got, I think, somebody on graphic medicine. Meenakshi knows the lineup, but we've got people who are coming in on vulnerability, drawing vulnerability from India as well as from
fantastic
First World. So
yeah,
because you do have an interest in the graphic novel and graphic medicine.
Yeah.
So.
Susan Square is speaking.
Okay, great. Yeah, great. I love Susan. Yeah, great. Okay, good.
So the others are artists from India too, and Katie Vance, who works on refugees and draws graphic novels about them. So the people from India will speak about the kind of work they have been doing. So we have digital projects on famines in British India, and people who have contributed to that. One of them will be turning up.
Great.
Yeah. So, right.
Yeah. Good.
Right. So I do not think anybody else is joining in today, and I'm so sorry that it has turned out to be this way. But it's given the four of us who are here a great time because we were able to talk to you, and it was more of a conversation than a lecture by the time. I mean, the initial lecture, great, we enjoyed it thoroughly and we learned, but the conversation which followed made all of us, I think, extremely happy, because usually Atul will keep quiet and say, I don't really know anything about this, I don't want to talk. But today, even Atul asked a question. So thank you so much, Professor Diedrich. It was a pleasure having you here with us, and I do hope you will look up the website. We'll be putting up the recordings in a week at the most. So once that's done, we'll let you know as well. And maybe you'll join us when we are doing the graphic medicine talk as well.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for all your comments. It was really wonderful. It was great to have a conversation like this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again for joining in, and we'll let you know our subsequent activities and events. We'll email you, and as soon as the recording goes up. So thank you, Diedrich. Have a good day.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.